My name is Jake Villwock, owner of Relentless Fly Fishing here based in Pennsylvania. I should say here, we're here in Pennsylvania doing this filming. The first fly we're going to tie today is a fly that I've been kind of messing with for a few years now. It's called the Crawl Daddy. It's my crayfish pattern for smallmouth bass. Also works well as a mantis shrimp for redfish. But this little fly right here has got a lot of movement, a lot of design features in it, and we'll kind of talk about it as we go through. But it is articulated one time. So we've got a jig style shank on the front, and we've got a single hook on the back. Gives it a little bit of movement, lots of rubber legs, and so yeah, let's go ahead and get started with this. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to take this is a number 2 Ahrex Light Stinger, and I'm going to put it in the vise kind of angled down because we're going to tie a couple materials right here at the bend of the hook. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to start a light thread base going back, and we're going to stop right about there because we want to run down just a little further, but I don't need to come back and forth a bunch. We're trying to manage our materials here. So one of the things I love about this hook is that it's light. It's a light wire, so it's got great penetration, but it also has a good bit of bend in it. So when it gets stuck on the bottom occasionally, it can actually be bent out multiple times and turned back before you have any structural issues with that. So typically I lose these flies before I've ever had a hook break. So first thing we're gonna do with the crayfish, we're gonna add a little bit of antenna in there. This is a barred Sili Leg in the nymph size, and this particular color is the green pumpkin with green fleck in it. So with all regals, I really like to use my material clip here as my kind of length adjustment, and so with these legs, if they're too long, they'll end up getting wrapped around the fly and the hook. So I'm going to go ahead and straight back here, and I'm just going to cut those right off at that material clip, and that's going to give me a good idea of the length that I want. Now with crayfish, all crayfish on this planet have some sort of orange in them, whether it's in their claws, in the junctions of their legs, something like that. So I think that to a smallmouth, orange is a confidence color. So we're going to take this EP Woolly Critter brush in hot orange, and we're going to tie this in, creating a small little hot spot. Now, one thing that you'll notice with these, one side I've already tied with, so it's straight material. On the other side, you've got a little bit of an exposed wire, which is great for tying in, but we're going to also use that as we get lower into this as kind of your piece to hold on to. So if I tie this straight in right here, we'd have to make a full wrap of this with a bunch of clumps of material. It wouldn't flare out super well. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pick off some of that material and get an exposed wire right there. We're going to tie in that wire. Now you have to kind of be careful with this sometimes because that wire is sharp, and if I tell you this, you can't tell anybody else, but I've definitely cut my thread on that wire. So we're going to do 2 wraps of this, and we're going to kind of pull it back, and that's going to give us a lot of kind of movement and filler without using too much material. One downside to these amazing brushes is they are kind of expensive, so the more life you can get out of one, the better. Also, with wire, you don't want to use your good scissors. So I have a pair of wire cutters here. These are by Loon. There's plenty of other brands out there, but these things just cut really well. They do flare out. This is a little pro tip. One thing I've done, so carrying them when I'm traveling, is I close them. I take one of these kind of wire things that we use that you can get at Home Depot and Lowe's, and I just wrap them up and they stay closed. It's kind of a cool little feature there. Now, with the claws, I really like to use pine squirrel for my claws, and the reason for that is that most of our native species of crayfish have smaller claws. Also, I've noticed that with smallmouth, they don't necessarily want to fight for their food. They're very efficient, they're very smart when it comes to what they're looking for. So as you saw on the other one, these are kind of smaller claws. They're not super intrusive, but they hold their form. One of the issues I've seen with longer claws, especially rabbit, is they tend to kind of collapse on themselves and then turns into like a leech when it's in the water, and they can also get wrapped around the hook. So what we're going to do before we tie those in is we're actually going to use a little bit of 3mm thin fly foam here, kind of as a little bit of buoyancy for the back end, and we'll explain that in a little bit, but also as a separation piece for that foam, or excuse me, for those claws. So looking at that, it's a little bit too thick for what I need, so I'm going to trim off just a tiny little bit of that. Steve will find that someday. Now we're going to tie these kind of angled down still because we want it to be kind of in that fighting shape. So if you'll notice, they're kind of sticking straight up and down. So when this hook goes straight in the vise, you'll see that they kind of just lean back just a little bit. So that's on the side closest to me. And then we'll do the same thing on this side. So I'm going to flip that up just so I can see what I'm doing. Get those little legs out of the way. Tie that in pretty tight. So we just want to make sure that that stays pretty well even there. I am going to hit this with a little bit of super glue later just to kind of secure that in there, but you can manipulate those to where you want them once you have them there. Then we're going to take the pine squirrel. I really like pine squirrel because pine squirrel naturally kind of bends in a little bit, but either way you're going to get a nice little claw. Now when I measure these claws out, this piece I just pulled straight out of the pack, so you'll notice it's a little bit too thin on the taper on the end. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut back about an inch of that hide. And when I do that, I'm going to save that for a later part, but that's going to give me a pretty thick claw even though it's a small material. So what we want to do is we want to measure this. We want the entire hide to be about twice the length or maybe a little bit shorter than the actual foam that we have there. So I'm going to go ahead and just measure that out to where I want it to be, and that looks pretty good. So we're going to cut this kind of at a little bit of an angle here, and we're going to tie that right on top of that foam. Now I'm going to say this because this happens all the time, so this is a great example, but if you look really close you can see that foam's almost popped all the way out. So we're going to retie that foam in just because you don't want that foam to slide out. Take my mistake and use it as a learning experience for everybody else. Get that in there. Looks good. So now we're going to take our claw material and we're going to tie that right in that crease there on the actual foam. That's another reason why I want to make sure I had a little bit of extra there, because we want to get that right in there. And there's a reason for that we'll explain in a second. So now we've got one side on. I'm going to do one more cool little trick that I do so you can see that's kind of flared out pretty far. To add a little bit of structural integrity to this, but also a little bit more durability, smallmouth bass have kind of zero grit sandpaper for teeth, so they can wreak havoc on some of this. We're just going to put a tiny little dot of super glue right there. Now if you take this and smash it down, you're gonna kind of capture a lot of those little fibers in there, so we don't want to do that. So what I'm just going to do is I'm just going to pull this tight, and I'm going to hold that for about 5 to 6 seconds, and you're good. It's not coming off. And with that, you're also going to have that claw is never going to kind of completely collapse on itself. So it's a dual purpose, kind of step there. Now we're just going to kind of taper that a little bit more. And this time you can kind of measure straight off of the other one because you want to be relatively the same length. However, nothing in nature is truly symmetrical, so they don't have to be the exact length, and you can always cut some off. You can't add any, so you want to be careful of that. Do the same thing over here, right in that little junction. Maybe. More thread is better than nothing on this one. So alright, we got that one in there. We're going to do the same thing as we did on the other side. Just one little drop there, not too much. Pull that tight. And that's going to stay right on there. So then we're just going to take a tiny little bit of super glue without dropping it on Steve's desk. And we're going to cover up that bottom just a little bit. That's going to help those that foam from moving too much. It's also going to really secure that stuff in there. And most tying super glue is kind of a tension based super glue, so if you just left that there without actually tying over top of it, you'd end up with super glue all over the place. So it's really good to kind of roll with that. Now this particular step you can kind of do or not do, it doesn't matter, but in the sense of making it look like a true crayfish, we're going to add eyeballs. A lot of times when I'm tying these, during guide season, I leave the eyeballs out because it's one extra step I don't have to do. These particular eyes are easy shrimp eyes. Love these things. They're pre-made so that you don't have to kind of mess around with, making sure they're even. And I'm just going to kind of bend these right at that kind of junction there. Nice up and down, and we're going to try to get these as close to the claws as we can. And this sometimes you got to play around with a little bit. But once you got them laid there, you can kind of, they have ribs on them, so it makes it really easy to kind of keep those on. And take my scissors and just pull this just a hair my way, and we should be good. All right, now that we have that in there, it's kind of a mess. I'm going to go ahead and straighten that hook shank up, and I'm going to tie the rest of that eyeball in. Now we've got ourselves upside down, and the reason for that is that I want to tie in the underbody from the bottom and wrap around. It gives me a little bit more control because all that material is facing, you know, kind of down or up, if you will. So we're going to flip it over to make it a little bit easier. I'm going to take that metal wire, same thing, tie that in, and we want to tie this all the way back to right at those claws. We're going to advance our thread about halfway, right there. And now we're going to take this, we're going to pull it all back like we did with the orange. And we're just going to wrap a couple really close ones. This is where we're going to start to get that taper for this crayfish. Now, if you're not familiar with kind of the biology or entomology of a crayfish, the back shell case is actually called the carapace. And so that's the thickest part of the crayfish, so we want to make sure that this stuff stays relatively thick. If you mat over itself, that's okay, because we're going to end up brushing it out, and I'll show you kind of a trick to getting those fibers out. We're just going to real tight wraps, creating as much bulk as we can to about the halfway point. Now, before I tie this in, I'm going to spin this over, and I want to tie this because we're going to use this again, so I'm going to keep this attached to the fly. We're just going to keep it out of our way on the bottom. Now we're going to take a dubbing brush, and with any type of kind of material that is on a brush or that's really fibery, you want to brush forward, and you can brush pretty aggressively on this stuff before you brush backwards. And as you brush backwards and forwards a couple times, you're going to pull out all those fibers that you trapped in there on those wraps, and you're going to end up with a pretty bulky little section there. So the next step, and this is something that I've messed around with a lot, is how we do a really nice shell back. You can do different things. You can use feathers if you want, but I like movement. I like to be able to fish these crayfish to fish even if I'm not truly moving them. And so what I found was rabbit zonker actually works really well. And instead of just tying on a, you know, kind of a clump of rabbit like this to give you that movement, what I want to do is create a taper of the body and a little bit of a shell back. So we're going to actually wet this up with our fingers, take a material clip, and we're going to put that right on there. Then we're going to cut these fibers off of the hide itself. So now we have, you know, a bunch of that. This is where you can, don't breathe, don't sneeze, don't laugh. I'm going to pull out a little bit at a time, and I'm just going to kind of try to stack it together as I pull it out. And then we're just going to smash it together, creating a nice little thing. You might have to pull some of those fibers out. But now what we're going to do is we're going to reverse tie this, which means we're going to stick the tips forward, just like you do with bucktail a lot of times. And we're just going to tie that just like that. I'm going to kind of move that around the shank a little bit. And then as I push this back, this is where you want to really pay attention to the length of that. You want to make sure that those fibers kind of bleed themselves into the claws a little bit. So after that, instead of making a dam, I'm just going to wrap straight over top of that, pull it tight once, pull it tight twice, just like that. That's going to start our little carapace there. And again, once it gets wet, it'll just kind of all fall down on itself. The next step, because crayfish have orange, is we're going to add 2 rubber lights to this. And this is the hot tip orange and olive. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to cut the majority of this orange off. And that's going to leave us with just 2 little orange tips. And I'm going to lay these right on the side, about the length of the claw themselves, maybe just a hair short. We're just going to wrap those right on the edge. 1 wrap to secure, 2 wraps to make sure it doesn't go anywhere, and then we're going to cut those off. There are other ways you could tie these legs in, but because we're using the tips themselves, we're going to tie them in kind of individually. Use those same ones on the other side. Measuring those out, tying those in right there. Now the beauty of rubber legs is they can kind of do whatever they want, so we're not super worried about, you know, kind of how they look or how they're laying, because when it gets wet, it's just going to kind of push that back over top of that, creating that profile. Now we're going to advance our thread the rest of the way forward. We're going to take this brush. We're going to try to go up over top of that little junction right there, but sometimes this stuff has a mind of its own. Somehow I got it to work this time, but there are plenty of times where I just give up and just start rolling. So you're going to get about 4 to 5 wraps of this moving forward. We want to leave a little bit of space right behind the hook eye, so right there I'm going to get 4 wraps, tie that off, and now that you've seen my fancy thing, I will leave those off. Right up underneath there, cut that off. Now we're going to repeat the same step that we just did on the back, with just a tiny bit less fur. Now you also want to pay attention to the length of the fur, because as you're moving forward, you're getting further and further away. So you want to make sure that you've got the right amount or the right length of fur, because right here, that's a little short for when we're going to fold it over. So I'm going to go down this hide just a little bit, pull that material back, and as we go, we're going to use just a tiny bit less each time. Pull that out, stack it. Gotta be careful with wet fingers that you don't pull it apart, pull it away from itself. Do the same thing here, just create that reverse tie. Couple securing wraps in there. And then I'm gonna push that back, and you'll notice this is where the bulk of that comes from. So this back piece is really just a continuous junction. This is gonna kind of fold right over top of it. Gonna make sure that flares out really well, and you'll notice that even this front piece kind of rolls right over top of that, and that's where you kind of create that bulk of that shell back, but it's not all sitting straight in the back. So we're just going to kind of lay that just like that. Now, because crayfish have a lot of different colors on them, we're actually going to use 3 different colored rubber legs. We're using the orange and olive for the back to kind of add to that junction, or that kind of what's the word I'm looking for? A hotspot of the orange. Then we're going to use this kind of olivey blue, and this is just going to add a little bit of a shimmer to the middle of that fly. We're just going to tie this right in on there. You'll also notice that they're a little bit shorter. As I go forward, I want my legs to be a tiny bit shorter. I don't want all my legs to be the same exact length. So we're going to fold this over. Now that we're using just one single color, we're going to fold that over top of itself. This gives me control of where I want to put it, but it also creates a little bit of extra structure to those legs because they can't get pulled out. Don't want to use too many thread wraps there, because you want to kind of minimize that junction. And at that point, we're going to do 3 whip finishes right in front, and then 3 more just to secure that down. And then just for a little bit of extra security and stability here, we're going to cover this thread with some UV glue. And I'm going to cover that up so you don't get all blinded. And then the last thing I'm going to do is just kind of brush out this bottom a little bit. So that's the back half of that crayfish. That's going to give you a nice little profile in the water. Also, those rubber legs are great because if you do mess up on any of the proportions, they really help kind of hide that. Next up we're going to do is we're going to take a 20mm 60-degree jig shank here. And this is a little bit of the larger size crayfish lengthwise. And we're going to typically put it in while it's in the vise just like that. But before we do that, we've got to add our bead. So with this bead that we're adding, this is a tungsten football bead. So that's a tungsten bead. I stopped using lead eyes on these because I liked the density of the tungsten. It really helps you be able to feel this fly on the bottom. But because it's a heavier material, this is why we added the foam. The foam actually creates a little bit of a counterbalance to this actual tungsten, so it doesn't drop super fast. It drops a little slow, and that's what we're looking for. We want those smallmouth to be able to see this thing as it drops to the bottom. Now this is a 6mm bead. You can get up to a 7.5mm or down to I think a 5mm bead, but 6.5 seems to be the size and the that I like the most when it comes to being able to drop that. Now this is another cool thing. Those wire ties that I use for my wire cutters, this is another great reason you have some of these wrapped around your vise. Right now you've got that kind of flailing around. If you flip this over, even though there's material clip, the hook's up, clamp that down, you're good to go. Now with this bead, you can tie this rest of this fly in if you want before that bead's super secured, but for me it drives me nuts when those things are kind of flopping around. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm just going to make a bazillion thread wraps here, kind of secure that thing in there. Making sure that's the right direction. Oops. And now it's not going to go anywhere. So we're going to advance our thread backwards. Now you've got a pretty big junction here in between these. So what I want to do is I'm going to try to tie my way up this shank. Now if I pull tight, you'll notice all that thread just fell down. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back and forth, creating a thread base to help go up there a little bit easier. Once I get that junction in there, it's not going to go anywhere. So we're going to take this EP woolly critter in sculpin color, which is what we use for the back, pull off just a little bit of that, but I want to keep just a tiny bit in there this time, trying to separate that from where I'm going to tie it, because I want that to kind of go up as far as it can, and it's going to be on a little bit of exposed wire or from the shank, so we want to try to get a little bit of extra connection in there. Now this, we're going to wrap as close as we can to that junction. And again, once you might have a little bit of a junction that you can see there, but once you wrap this stuff up pretty tight, brush it out, and then put that rabbit over top of it, you'll notice that that junction kind of disappears when it's wet. So we're not super worried about that at this point. We're going to make one more wrap forward. Right there is where you're going to be. So go ahead and cut that off. Secure that in, and we're going to brush this out. So again, brushing forward first, going all the way around. So even though I don't use a rotary vise for its intended purposes of being able to put this stuff on really fast, I do love these rotary vices for this reason, because you can kind of just brush your way around and you're good at that point. I also really love this new hook jaw, because it gives me the ability to, one, cover up the hook point, because you're supposed to put the hook all the way in so you don't have any exposed hook on that, but also when it comes to using shanks, you can notice that it goes straight back now versus before they kick way up. So you've got a really good ability to, you know, judge your proportions and all that fun stuff. So it's a great jaw for any articulated stuff. Now with this one, we've got a little bit longer of a junction, so we want to make sure we have the longest fibers that we can. And I will go as far as going into the fly shop and pulling out these things to make sure that I have at least half the pack that are about 1 inch to 1.25 inches long, because that's what I need the most of when it comes to tying this crayfish. So with this particular spot, to save on some of the length of this, we're not going to reverse tie this. We're going to tie this one tips back. So this is going to just kind of go straight over top of that. Now I just lost a bunch of that, so this is going to be careful. You can sometimes have to restack it, but should be good on that. So we're going to tie this in, tips forward. I don't like the way that landed, so we're going to go forward just a little bit. And you're going to notice that that goes right over top of that and marries in there. But I'm not going to flare it too much, because this is technically the tail end of it. So you don't want it to just be bulky all the way to the end. You want it to kind of gradually taper itself down. I'm just going to tie in all that extra stuff there, because that's going to help me make sure that that doesn't get pulled out at all. So we've lost a little bit, but not much. We're good on that. Just going to lay flat back over there. You see when it gets wet, it goes right over top of that. Now, third set of rubber legs. These are olive, black, and chartreuse barred. I love this because it adds just a tiny bit of chartreuse hint to this, but not too much. And again, just 2 legs in each, so we're going to end up with 12 total legs. We're going to fold this over. Tie that in, just slide that straight down to the side you want it. Tie that in. One thing I will say, when you're tying rubber legs in, it's always good to go, if you're tying them on both sides, go back to the spot that you just tied those first ones in, because then you're going to get the most symmetrical when it comes to tying those in. You don't have to worry about, you know, making them longer or shorter or any of that stuff. They're going to be the same length, and they're going to lay relatively in the same spot. So we'll flare those out just a hair, and we're good to go. Now we have this huge junction here in the middle. or this open space here at the end, I should say, not in the middle. What we're gonna do now is we're gonna create a dubbing loop. Now, when it comes to making dubbing loops, a lot of times when it comes to using actual dubbing, it's great to throw a little bit of wax on there. But I'm gonna make a dubbing loop with pine squirrel. And when you put wax in there, it ends up matting it all the way down, so it doesn't flare out quite as much. But you can see here, there's a pretty big gap. So if I were to pull this tight, you're still gonna have the gap and that stuff can fall out. So what I'm gonna do, instead of spinning it, I'm just gonna take my thread, I'm gonna wrap my thread around that twice and pull that tight. Now you have a perfect little teardrop right there, so you're gonna have full tension on that at all times. We're gonna take our Stonfo dubbing spinner, which I love the most, it's got a ball bearing in there, and we're just gonna, the cool part is when you pull that tight, completely straps down. So we're gonna lay that right there. Now, you can take that piece that you cut off and you can use that again. I do that typically on the smaller ones, but because this is a longer one and we've got a little bit more space to cover up, I'm gonna use the rest of my other one. Told you I'd lose it, which I don't know what I did with it. Found it. Always look in your lap when you can't find something. So we're gonna pull that tight. Again, use your kind of wet that a little bit to get those fibers straight up. And we want about 1 inch to 1.25 inches in length of this. So, and this is gonna give us enough to really cover that gap, but it also creates a taper. The reason why I'm using this and not rabbit is because I don't want it to be super big and bulky. I just want it to cover up that gap. So we're gonna lay this right on the edge. The beauty of these things is they got a little taper in them, so that thread will actually slide down in that clip, and we've got it. So that's pretty far away, so I'm gonna slide this all the way up. And as I slide it up, I'm actually gonna kind of try to separate it a little bit to create a little bit more length. Now, when I spin this, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna hold it, spin it once, and then I'm gonna let go. That's gonna give you a really nice spin on that, and you're not gonna lose anything because you're gonna be under tension at all times. Spin that a few more times. The other reason why I separate a little bit is because as you tighten that thread, it gets a little smaller. So we wanna have that as long as possible. I'm gonna brush out some of those fibers, and then we're just gonna wrap this, filling that gap, kind of securing that stuff in there. And again, you don't have to use it all, but I'm gonna use it all just because I want to make sure that nothing in here moves. Once we get that all in there, 2 wraps with the actual thread, I'm gonna pull that tight. The reason why I pull that tight is it kind of mats that down in, or pulls that down into the junction between the bead and the shank there. And this is super, super strong compared to your other thread. And once that's in there, before I cut that off, I'm gonna wrap around twice with my thread one more time. I'm gonna pull that in, 2 wraps to make sure it doesn't go anywhere. Cut that off. I'm gonna hit that with a little bit of saliva, get those fibers out of the way. You don't need to do a lot of thread wraps on this because we are gonna kind of secure that in there, and most of this thread is kind of secured way down in there. So at this point, you've got that little hole right there in the slotted bead. Just gonna kind of fill that hole up. Hit that with the light. And we're good to go. So this is the Crawl Daddy in the slightly larger size. That hook is really sharp, which is good. But you'll see you've got that really nice taper. I'm going to try to hold it up there. You've got a nice taper out to those claws, and that's what's going to make all those smallmouth eat it. And then you've got movement in there. So that's the Crawl Daddy, and thanks for watching.